On September 10th, the morning of my 7th birthday, I came downstairs to the kitchen where my mother was washing the dishes and my father was reading the paper. And I sort of presented myself to them in the doorway. And they said, "Hey, happy birthday." And I said, "I'm 7." And my father smiled and said, "Well, you know what that means, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, that I'm going to have a party and a cake and get a lot of presents?" And my dad said, "Well, yes. But more importantly, being 7 means that you've reached the age of reason, and you're now capable of committing any and all sins against God and man." Now, I had heard this phrase, age of reason, before. Sister Mary Kevin had been banding it about our 2nd grade class at school, but when she said it, the phrase seemed all caught up in the excitement of preparations for our first communion and our first confession, and everybody knew that was really all about the white dress and the white veil. And anyway, I hadn't really paid all that much attention to that phrase, age of reason. So I said, yeah, age of reason. What does that mean again? And my dad said, "Well, we believe in the Catholic Church that God knows that little kids don't know the difference between right and wrong, but when you're 7, you're old enough to know better. So you've grown up and reached the age of reason, and now God will start keeping notes on you and begin your permanent record." And I said, "Oh. Wait a minute. You mean all that time up till today, all that time I was so good, God didn't notice it?" And my mother said, "Well, I noticed it." And I thought, how could I not have known this before? How could it not have sunk in when they'd been telling me all that being good and no real credit for it? And worst of all, how could I not have realized this very important information until the very day that it was basically useless to me? So I said, "Well, Mom and Dad, what about Santa Claus? I mean, Santa Claus knows if you're naughty or nice, right?" And my dad said, "Yeah, but honey, I think that's technically just between Thanksgiving and Christmas." And my mother said, "Oh, Pop, stop it. Let's just tell her. I mean, she is 7. Julie, there is no Santa Claus." Now, this was actually not that upsetting to me. My parents had this whole elaborate story about Santa Claus, how they had talked to Santa himself and agreed that instead of Santa delivering our presents over the night of Christmas Eve, like he did for every other family who got to open their surprises first thing Christmas morning, our family would give Santa more time. Santa would come to our house while we were at 9 o'clock high mass, but only if all of us kids did not make a fuss, which made me very suspicious. It was pretty obvious that it was really our parents giving us the presents. I mean, my dad had a very distinctive wrapping style, and my mother's handwriting was so close to Santa's. Plus, why would Santa save time by having to loop back to our house after he'd gone to everybody else's? There's only one obvious conclusion to reach from this mountain of evidence. Our family was too strange and weird for even Santa Claus to come visit. And my poor parents were trying to protect us from the embarrassment, this humiliation of rejection by Santa, who was jolly, but let's face it, he was also very judgmental. So to find out that there was actually no Santa Claus at all was really sort of a relief. I left the kitchen not really in shock about Santa, but rather I was just dumbfounded about how I could have missed that whole age of reason thing. It was too late for me. But maybe I could help someone else, someone who could use the information. They had to fit 2 criteria. They had to be old enough to be able to understand the whole concept of the age of reason and not yet 7. The answer was clear. My brother Bill, he was 6. Well, I finally found Bill about a block away from our house at this public school playground. It was a Saturday, and he was all by himself just kicking a ball against the side of a wall. I ran up to him and said, "Bill, I just realized that the age of reason starts when you turn 7, and then you're capable of committing any and all sins against God and man." Bill said, "So?" And I said, "So? You're 6. You have a whole year to do anything you want to, and God won't notice it." And he said, "So?" And I said, "So? So everything." And I turned to run so angry with him, but when I got to the top of these steps, I turned around dramatically and said, "Oh, by the way, Bill, there is no Santa Claus." Now, I didn't know it at the time, but I actually wasn't turning 7 on September 10th. For my 13th birthday, I planned a slumber party with all of my girlfriends. But a couple of weeks beforehand, my mother took me aside and said, "I need to speak to you privately. September 10th is not your birthday, it's actually October 10th. And I said, "What?" And she said, "Listen, The cutoff for birth dates for kindergarten was September 15th. So I told him that your birthday was September 10th, and then I wasn't sure that you weren't just going to go blab it all over the place, so I started to tell you your birthday was actually September 10th. But Julie, you were so ready to start school. Honey, you were so ready. I thought back on it, and when I was 4, I was already the oldest of 4 children, and my mother even had another child to come. So what I think she understandably really meant was that she was so ready, she was so ready. Then she said, don't worry, Julie, every year on October 10th, when it was your birthday, but you didn't realize it, I made sure that you ate a piece of cake that day. Which was comforting, but troubling. My mother had been celebrating my birthday with me, without me. What was so upsetting about this piece of information was not that I was going to have to change the date of my slumber party with all of my girlfriends. What was most upsetting was that this meant I was not a Virgo. I had a huge Virgo poster in my bedroom, and I read my horoscope every single day, and it was so totally me. And this meant that I was a Libra? So I took the bus downtown to get the new Libra poster. The Virgo poster was a picture of a beautiful woman with long hair sort of lounging by some water, but the Libra poster was just a huge scale. This was around the time that I started filling out physically, and I was filling out a lot more than a lot of the other girls, and frankly, the whole idea that my astrological sign was a scale just seemed ominous and depressing. But I got the new Libra poster, and I started to read my new Libra horoscope. And I was astonished to find that it was also totally me. It wasn't until years later, looking back on this whole age of reason, change of birth date thing, that it dawned on me. I wasn't turning 7 when I thought I turned 7. I actually had a whole other month to do anything I wanted to before God started keeping tabs on me. Oh, life can be so unfair. Not too long ago, 2 Mormon missionaries came to my door. I live just off a main thoroughfare in Los Angeles, and my block is a natural beginning for people who are peddling things door to door. Sometimes I get little old ladies from the Seventh-day Adventist Church showing me these pictures of heaven, and sometimes I get teenagers who promise me that they won't join a gang and just start robbing people if I only buy some magazine subscriptions from them. So normally, I just ignore the doorbell, but on this day, I answered. And there stood 2 boys, each about 19, in white starched short-sleeve shirts, and they had little name tags that identified them as official representatives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they said they had a message for me, from God. I said, a message for me? From God? And they said, yes. Now, I was raised in the Pacific Northwest around a lot of Mormons, and, I've worked with them and even dated them, but I never really knew the doctrine or what they said to people when they were out on a mission, and I guess I was sort of curious, so I said, well, please, come in. And they looked really happy because I don't think this happens to them all that often. And I sat them down and I got them glasses of water, and after our niceties, I said, okay, I'm ready for my message from God. But they had a question instead, which threw me a little bit. I thought it would be more like a pitch at a studio, and I would hear their story, and then if I were interested, I would have my people call their people or something. But apparently this was going to be interactive. And they said, do you believe that God loves you with all his heart? And I thought, well, of course I believe in God, but I don't like that word heart because that anthropomorphizes God. And I don't like the word his either because that sort of sexualizes God. But I didn't want to argue semantics with these boys, so after a very long, uncomfortable pause, I said, yes, I do. I feel very loved. And they looked at each other and smiled like that was the right answer. And then they said, do you believe that we're all brothers and sisters on this planet? And I said, yes, I do. And I was so relieved that it was a question I could answer so quickly. And they said, well, then we have a story to tell you. And they told me the story all about this guy named Lehi who lived in Jerusalem in 600 BC. Now, apparently, in Jerusalem in 600 BC, everyone was completely bad and evil, every single one of them, man, woman, child, infant, fetus. And God came to Lehi and he said, put your family on a boat and I will lead you out of here. And God did lead them. He led them to America. I said, America? From Jerusalem to America by boat in 600 BC? And they said, yes. Then they told me how Lehi and his descendants reproduced, and over the course of 600 years, there were two great races of them, the Nephites and the Lamanites. And the Nephites were totally, totally good, each and every one of them, and the Lamanites were totally bad and evil, every single one of them just bad to the bone. Then, after Jesus died on the cross for our sins, on his way up to heaven, he stopped by America and visited the Nephites. And he told them that if they all remained totally, totally good, each and every one of them, they would win the war against the evil Lamanites. But apparently somebody blew it, because the Lamanites were able to kill all the Nephites, all but one guy, this guy named Mormon, who managed to survive by hiding in the woods. And he made sure this whole story was written down in reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics chiseled onto golden plates, which he then buried near Palmyra, New York. Well, I was so into this story, I was just on the edge of my seat. I said, what happened to the Lamanites? And they said, well, they became our Native Americans here in the U.S. And I said, so you believe the Native Americans were descended from a people who were totally evil? And they said, yes. Then they told me how this guy named Joseph Smith found those buried gold plates, basically right in his backyard. And he also found this magic stone back there that he put into his hat and then buried his face into it. And this allowed him to translate the gold plates from the Reformed Egyptian into English. Well, at this point, I just wanted to give these two boys some advice about their pitch. I wanted to say, okay, don't start with this story. I mean, even the Scientologists know to give a personality test before they start telling people all about Xenu, the evil intergalactic overlord. Well, then they said to me, do you believe that God speaks to us through his righteous prophets? And I said, no, I don't. Because I was sort of upset about this Lamanite story and this crazy gold plate story. But the truth was, I hadn't really thought this through, so I backpedaled a little bit. And I said, well, what do you mean by righteous exactly? And what do you mean by prophets? Like, could the prophets be women? And they said, no. And I said, why? And they said, well, it's because God gave women a gift that is so spectacular. It is so wonderful that the only gift he had left over to give men was the gift of prophecy. What is this wonderful gift God gave women, I wondered? Maybe their greater ability to cooperate and adapt? Women's longer lifespan, the fact that women tend to be much less violent than men. But no, it was not any of these gifts. They said, well, it's her ability to bear children. I said, oh, come on. Even if women tried to have a baby every single year from the time they were 15 to the time they were 45, assuming most of them didn't die off from exhaustion, it still seems like some women would have some time left over to hear the word of God. And they said, no. Well, then they didn't look so fresh-faced and cute to me anymore, but they had more to say. They said, well, we also believe that if you're a Mormon and if you're in good standing with the church, when you die, you get to go to heaven and be with your family for all eternity. And I said, oh, dear. That wouldn't be such a good incentive for me. And they said, oh. Well, we also believe that when you go to heaven, you get your body restored to you in its best original state. Like if you'd lost a leg, why, you get it back. Or if you'd gone blind, you could see. I said, oh, now, I don't have a uterus because I had cancer a few years ago. So does this mean that if I went to heaven, I would get my old uterus back? And they said, sure. And I said, I don't want it back. I'm happy without it. Gosh, what if you had a nose job and you liked it? Would God force you to get your old nose back? Well, then they gave me a Book of Mormon, and they told me to read this chapter and that chapter, and they said they'd come back someday and check in on me, and I think I said something like, please don't hurry, or maybe it was just, please don't, and they were gone. Okay, so I initially felt really superior to these boys, and smug in my more conventional faith, But then the more I thought about it, the more I had to be honest with myself. If someone came to my door and I was hearing Catholic theology and dogma for the very first time, and they said, "We believe that God impregnated a very young girl without the use of intercourse, and the fact that she was a virgin is maniacally important to us, and she had a baby, and that's the Son of God," I mean, I would think that was equally ridiculous. I'm just so used to that story. So I couldn't let myself feel condescending towards these boys. But the question they asked me when they first arrived really stuck in my head. Did I believe that God loved me with all his heart? Because I wasn't exactly sure how I felt about that question. Now, if they had asked me, do you feel that God loves you with all his heart? I think that would have been much different. I think I would have instantly answered, yes, I feel it all the time. I feel God's love when I'm hurt and confused, and I feel consoled and cared for. I take shelter in God's love when I don't understand why tragedy hits, and I feel God's love when I look with gratitude at all the beauty I see. But since they asked me this question, with the word believe in it, somehow it was all different, because I guess I wasn't exactly sure if I believed what I so clearly felt. Okay, my religious history in a nutshell. I was raised Catholic, and for me, it was all in all a good experience. I know we can't stop reading about all of the horrific and abusive experiences that people have had growing up in the Catholic Church recently in the papers. But for me, it was mostly wonderful. I always felt lucky to be a Catholic. My parents were both from Catholic families that went as far back as anyone knew on either side. My parents both went to all Catholic schools, grade school, high school, college, and then my father even went to Catholic law school. My father told us kids that when he was in high school, the Jesuits separated out some of the boys, and they were on this separate advanced track, and he studied Latin for 4 years and Greek for 3 years. And out of the 16 of his special group, 11 of them became Jesuit priests themselves. When my father told us kids this story, we thought, he's got to be like this genius who's being groomed for the priesthood. But lucky for us, he chose to get married instead. When I was old enough, my father introduced me to his favorite writers, which he pointed out were Catholic writers. G.K. Chesterton, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, Flannery O'Connor. They were in a club that we were into, and I felt lucky and privileged. I think my favorite time to be a Catholic was in high school. My first 2 years of high school, I went to an all-girls school taught primarily by nuns, and I befriended one sister in particular, Sister Antonella, and she often invited me over to the convent for dinner. And maybe because it was such a contrast to my home life at that time, I mean, I was the eldest of 5 children in a typical busy Irish Catholic home, but for me, the life of the nuns just seemed like heaven. The convent was really quiet and calm, and the women were dedicated to the education of their students, and dinner discussion centered on theological debate, or what I thought was theological debate. Maybe they just talked about a poem that everyone liked, but it was just so civilized. I don't know, the convent seemed like books and incense and rosary beads and meditation and like rationality. The sisters lived in an order, but they sure seemed to have their lives in order as well. Now, my adult self knows that I am definitely romanticizing these nuns, but in the 7 or so times that I ate dinner over there and in almost all my personal dealings with them, that's how I remember it. I became a little bit of a nunophile. My favorite show as a kid was The Flying Nun. I watched all those nun movies with relish. Song of Bernadette, The Singing Nun. After watching Brother Sun, Sister Moon, I took the confirmation name Claire because I, like St. Clare, was in love with St. Francis. I memorized The Trouble with Angels and Where Angels Go, Trouble Follows, and I secretly wished that I were Haley Mills, and I practiced saying, "I've got the most scathingly brilliant idea." Naturally, I wanted to be a nun myself for a little while in high school, and I confessed my dream to Sister Antonella, and she told me that the church didn't really allow girls as young as me to enter the convent, but she could arrange for me to spend the weekend at another convent to see if I liked it. This other convent was not like the convent at Marycliff. The nuns just lived in a house in some regular old neighborhood, and they just wore jeans and plaid shirts and played guitar and sang Kumbaya and like helped the poor and the sick. Ha! I didn't want any of that hippie kind of nun life. I wanted a habit and a cell, and I wanted to flog myself and wear a hair shirt. And I wanted the Gregorian chant wafting through the halls that I would walk down right next to the wall, because to walk in the middle of the hallway was to be arrogant. I wanted to be silent and make all of those hand signals that the contemplative nuns make during meals that mean more salt and thank you for the salt. And I wanted my long, thick hair to be cut off abruptly like Audrey Hepburn in A Nun Story, and then I wanted to prostrate myself before the cross. But it wasn't just the type of convent that was a problem. There were also boys. I was way into boys. Even though for a while, I really did think it could be me and Jesus together forever. I had this picture of Jesus in my bedroom, and he had this shag haircut and these big, beseeching, totally understanding eyes and a sexy beard. I will confess to you that Jesus helped me discover the pleasures of my own body. Anyway, as I grew and matured, my understanding of God also grew and matured. He really was sort of Santa Claus at first, but then he became more abstract. I had many experiences which I considered to be religious, which confirmed my belief in God. I had religious experiences. I had a few times, maybe 5 or 6 times, felt the power of the Holy Spirit come over me and just shake me to the core. In fact, just before the Mormon boys arrived, I had my perhaps most visceral and profound religious experience. You see, I had just suffered the traumatic end to a 4-year relationship that, well, I had a lot riding on. I was madly in love, and he was not. I wanted us to raise children together, and he did not. And then one day he went away, and I thought I would die, but I didn't. Night after night, I was waking up crying, barely able to breathe. It felt like a knife was being plunged into my chest. It seemed like the end of the road. My dream of being a mother had met a fatal blow. And then one night, I woke up with the familiar pain and shortness of breath, and I could hear myself saying the words, "Heal me, heal me." I must have been just out of my mind with grief. And suddenly, I felt this bright light in the room. Or maybe it was just a feeling inside me, like something burst or released or something, but I felt a powerful presence, a powerful force of love and transcendence. For the first time in weeks, I felt whole, and I felt absolutely connected to everything, and I knew that I would be healed and that God had a plan for me and that my breakup was just part of my divine destiny. The next day, I was almost blushing to myself thinking about this incident. And I felt close to God, closer than ever before. And I did feel healed, because you see, God had healed me. So now you can sort of see how when a few days later these 2 Mormon boys arrived on my doorstep and said that God had a message for me, why I was stopped in my tracks and actually let them in. And I realized that I was kind of embarrassed that it had taken me so long to answer that very simple question. Did I believe that God loved me? And I thought, how dare they walk into my house and ask me such a personal, private question so cavalierly? It made me kind of angry. But I wasn't sure if I was angry at them or at me. And I realized that I had really been getting a bit lazy about my faith. In an odd way, the Mormon boys' dedication inspired me, and I think I glimpsed in them the girl inside of me who wanted to be a nun, a person who was willing to go the distance in matters of faith. So I decided I would rededicate myself to the Catholic Church. I went to several different churches and finally settled on joining one about 10 miles from my house near the ocean. It was liberal, it was big, and it had this dedicated and enthusiastic congregation. Their masses were wonderful, so emotional, so full of feeling, I would have to choke back tears just to say the Nicene Creed every time I went. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and of all things seen and unseen. Oh, I love reciting that. The voices in church all together in unison. But I wanted to say it with conviction, not as a child who was just grown up absorbing all of these ideas, but with an adult's understanding, in my heart and soul, the way that God says we should. Now, I noticed in the announcements that they offered a Bible study class on Thursday nights, and honestly, almost on a whim, I decided to sign up for it. Now, you know, the Catholics don't really emphasize the Bible all that much. Their attitude is sort of, leave that book to the professionals. Don't you worry your little self with that complicated book. But what little I did know about the Bible, I knew there were parts I loved. Often when I felt scared or confused, I repeated the 23rd Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall not fear, because you are with me. And I felt so much better. Now, I was happy to see that the Old Testament starts out with two conflicting stories about the origin of the universe. One where Adam and Eve are created at the exact same moment, and then a second creation story right away in chapter 2 where Adam is created first and then Eve is created out of his rib after he gets lonely. And I thought, oh, wow. For all those people who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible or that every single word of the Bible is true, I mean, they can't even have read the first 2 chapters of the Bible. I remember that Sister Charitina told us in 8th grade that Genesis was simply a poem on creation. We were not to take it literally. I shared this with the Bible study class, and Father Tom, this Irish priest who was leading the class, said, "That's exactly right, Julia, a poem on creation." Yes, nicely said, yes. But then we got to stories like Noah and the ark. And it was kind of funny. I don't really remember when I was studying this as a kid, Sister Mary Kevin highlighting the fact that Noah becomes an alcoholic after the flood and spends most of his time passed out and naked to the point where his sons have to go back up into a room with a blanket just to go cover him up because, geez, Dad. I realized I had always had the Bible served up to me piecemeal and in sections, and it had been edited, severely edited. It was quite different reading it as an adult. As an adult, you could begin to see the whole puzzle. As an adult, it was disturbing. For example, when I read about the flood as a kid, I didn't think about the fact that God killed everyone because he was angry. He just drowned them all because he thought they were all bad, which you have to assume included a lot of kids and unborn fetuses, which I guess was okay with God. But then I was relieved to read that God actually comes to Noah afterwards, and he says, you know, the whole flood thing, it might have been a big mistake. And he promises he'll never do it again. And that was another surprise. God has regrets. Then we got to stories like Sodom and Gomorrah. All I remembered about that story is that they were these 2 sinful cities like Las Vegas and Reno or something. And God got mad and wiped them out. And Lot's wife looked back when she was told not to, and she got turned into a pillar of salt. But the nuns in my grade school didn't explain to us what happens right before they flee. Right before they flee, Lot is visited by these 2 angels who are masquerading as 2 men, and they come and stay overnight at his house, and this mob forms outside, and they yell, "Send out those 2 angel-like men to us so we can have sex with them." And Lot yells, "No!" which I think is a basic rule of hospitality. Don't give up your guests to be raped by the angry mob outside. But then what does he say next? He says, why don't you take my daughters and rape and do what you will with them? They're virgins. Okay, so Lot is evil, right? How is it that the story we know about him is about his wife getting turned into a pillar of salt? Maybe that was her only way out. Maybe being a big pillar of salt is preferable to being married to Lot. Anyway, after Lot and his 2 traumatized daughters flee Sodom and Gomorrah, they all go to a cave in the mountains and hide out. And during the night, Lot's 2 daughters get Lot drunk and then rape him. Did they do this in revenge of what their father did to them? No, the Bible says it's because there aren't any other men around. Even though the Bible also says that they're not that far from a city named Zoar, so I guess no men around for maybe a few miles? And wait a minute, so Lot's 2 daughters just had to drug and rape somebody, and then I guess if you're their dad and you're the only one. Okay. I knew the Bible had nutty stories. I mean, I knew there were nutty stories, but I don't know, I guess I thought they'd be wedged in amongst an ocean of inspiration and history. But instead, the stories just got darker and even more convoluted. This Old Testament God makes the grisliest tests of people's loyalty, like when he asks Abraham to murder his son Isaac. As a kid, we were taught to admire it. I caught my breath reading it. We were taught to admire it? What kind of sadistic test of loyalty is that, to ask someone to kill his or her own child? And isn't the proper answer no? I will not kill my child or any child, even if it means eternal punishment in hell? At the next Bible study class, Father Tom reminded us that Isaac represents what matters to Abraham most, and that's what God asks us to give up for him. I said, but protecting and loving and caring for the welfare of your child is such a deep, ethical, loving instinct and act. So what if what matters to you most is your own loving behavior? Should we be willing to give up our ethics for God? And he said, no, because your ethics is your love and faith in God. That confused me a little bit, but I decided to just let that one go. But then I found that Abraham isn't the only person willing to murder his own child for God. In the Bible, they're actually all over the place. For example, in the book of Judges, this guy named Jephthah tells God that if he can win this battle, he will kill the first person who greets him when he comes home as a burnt offering. And who is the first person he sees? His only child, his beloved daughter, who runs to him playing with tambourines and singing, "Hi, Daddy." What? And does God say, no, don't kill your only child as a burnt offering to me? Or even, Jephthah, who did you expect to be the first person to greet you when you came home? No, it appears the most important point of this story is that Jephthah allows his beautiful daughter to go off into the woods for 2 months to mourn her virginity. I kept thinking, run, before she comes back and he kills her by lighting her on fire. Even if you leave aside the creepy sacrifice your own offspring stories, the laws of the Old Testament were really hard to take. Leviticus and Deuteronomy are filled with archaic, just hard to imagine laws. Like if a man has sex with an animal, both the man and the animal should be killed, which I could almost understand for the man. But the animal? Because the animal was a willing participant? Because now the animals have the taste of human sex and won't be satisfied with that. Even things that I thought were set in stone, like literally set in stone, like the 10 Commandments, weren't. The 10 Commandments that we are almost familiar with are these rules that God simply told Moses on Mount Sinai without referring to them as commandments, without even setting them in stone. It's only later in Exodus, when Moses goes back up to Mount Sinai, that God gives him a set of 2 tablets of stone with these rules chiseled on them. When Moses gets back down off the mountain, he sees the people worshiping a golden calf, and he has a tantrum, and he smashes the stones before he reads them. So then Moses goes back up to Mount Sinai, and God gives him another set of stone tablets. And this is the first time at this point that they are referred to as the commandments, and they're chiseled into stone. So you'd sort of think that God's got to be pretty firm on the subject of commandments by now. But the rules are significantly different than those other rules. Like how all male children have to appear before God 3 times a year, however that's supposed to be accomplished, and how you shouldn't cook a baby goat in its mother's milk, and how every domestic animal's firstborn male should be sacrificed. But then the commandment goes on to say that if you don't want to sacrifice your donkey's firstborn male, you could go ahead and substitute a lamb's if you really needed to. Some people think that without the 10 Commandments, morality in society would be relative and wishy-washy, but in the Bible, morality is relative and wishy-washy. In fact, it sure seems like our modern morality is much more loving and humane than the Bible's morality. Well, Father Tom saw me outside of church after Mass one Sunday, and he said, "Julia, you know, you always look so very sad in Bible study class." And I said, "I'm sorry, Father, it's just that God is so offensive in the Bible. Really, it's like he's bipolar." He said, "Well, you know, the Old Testament. Just remember that the people who wrote it were an ancient Bronze Age civilization. I mean, the stories are legends. They're tales of trickery and deception that were told around the campfire by sheiks who made God impressive by their very ancient standards." I said, "Oh, wow. Looking at the Old Testament that way, it actually makes a lot of sense now, Father. Looking at the Old Testament that way, it's quite interesting." But Homer was also an ancient Bronze Age writer writing about gods. I mean, how much are we supposed to believe is actually true? And he said, "Well, there's no evidence that Abraham is anything other than legend, or Isaac, or Moses, or even the whole Exodus story. I said, the Exodus story is a myth? And he said, well, myth-ish. And I said, how can something be myth-ish? And he said, well, the Exodus story is a myth in the sense that it never actually happened. But it's not a myth in the fact that the people believe the story was true and shape their identity as a culture based on thinking that. But Julia, you can't read the Bible with modern historical eyes. You've got to read it with the eyes of faith, because this is the story that God wants us to know. I left the church thinking, okay, calm down. This is the Old Testament. Old. Old is right in the title. A newer testament is coming up. And that's why God must have sent his son Jesus, because we clearly hadn't gotten the message right? Jesus was all about tearing down those old, archaic ways of worship and reminding people that what mattered most was what we were like on the inside. I could hardly wait to meet Jesus again, as if it were the first time. But oh dear. Well, first of all, Jesus was much angrier than I expected him to be. I mean, I knew he got angry with all those money changers in the temple and everything, but I just had no idea that he was so angry so much of the time. And very impatient. Jesus says that he speaks in parables because the people, they just don't understand anything else. But the parables are often foggy and meaningless, and Jesus is snippy when even the disciples don't get them. He says to them, if you don't understand this parable, then how can you understand any parable? And are you incapable of understanding? I kept thinking, don't teach in parables then. It's not working. Even your staff doesn't understand them. Why don't you just say what you mean? Okay, so Jesus isn't so patient, and I think he picked a very ineffective lesson-giving technique, and he's angry most of the time, but that doesn't make him bad. It's just, wow, I really expected someone else. Some of the parables are not just foggy. To me, they're sort of offensive. Like in Luke, Jesus helps us understand God's relationship with humans by telling us a story about how God treats people the way people treat their slaves. They beat some more than they beat others. Okay, I know this was a different time and everything, and I really tried to keep that in mind as the Bible refers to slavery all over the place. And not only does it not say it's wrong, I mean, the Bible gives you advice about how you're supposed to keep your slaves and how slaves should behave obediently at all times to their masters. But I don't know, I guess I sort of thought the Son of God would say slavery was wrong. But no, Jesus does not say that. In fact, he uses slavery as an example of how God treats people. It was really hard to stay on Jesus' side when he started saying really aggressive, just hateful things. Like in Luke chapter 21, Jesus says that he is like a king who says, anyone who does not recognize me, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Or in John chapter 15, Jesus says, anyone who does not believe in me is like a withered branch that will be cast into the fire and burned. In Matthew, he says, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And in Luke, he says, and if you don't have a sword, sell your clothes and buy one. Then Jesus just starts acting downright crazy. Like in Matthew chapter 21, when this fig tree doesn't have a fig for Jesus to eat, he condemns the fig tree to death. That's right, Jesus condemns a fig tree to death. Not a parable, by the way, just Jesus pissed off that the fig tree didn't have a fig for him to eat when he wanted one. Not exactly the Prince of Peace who taught us to turn the other cheek. And then there's family. I have to say that for me, the most deeply upsetting thing about Jesus is his family values, which is amazing when you think how there's so many groups out there who say they base their family values on the Bible. I mean, he seems to have no real close ties to his parents. He puts his mother off cruelly over and over again. At the wedding feast, he says to her, "Woman, what have I to do with you?" And once, while he was speaking to a crowd, Mary waited patiently off to the side to talk to him, and Jesus said to the disciples, "Send her away, because you are my family now." Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell this exact same story, but Mark actually tells us why Mary was there to see Jesus. He says Mary came to see Jesus to restrain him, because the people were saying he's gone out of his mind. I kept thinking, yes, let's go get Jesus and get him some help. Anyway, Jesus discourages any contact his converts have with their own families. He himself does not marry or have children, and he explicitly tells his followers not to have families as well, and if they do, they should just abandon them. Now, mostly Jesus says this because he believed the end of all time was imminent. Jesus said over and over again that the people who were alive when he was alive would not die naturally, but see the end times. He tells us this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, okay, Jesus tells us not to have families because he mistakenly believed that the end of all time was imminent, but then he tells us not to take care of the families that we do have already. Like in Luke chapter 14, Jesus says, anyone who comes to me and does not hate father and mother, brothers and sisters, wife and children, cannot be my disciple. I mean, isn't that what cults do? Get you to reject your family in order to inculcate you? So that's the New Testament family values for you, the supposed big improvement over the Old Testament family values, which seem to me to be mostly about incest and mass slaughter and protecting your own specific genetic line at all costs. After the Gospels, there's a bunch of letters written by the early Christians, the most important of which are written by St. Paul. Now, the Bible's view of women is dreadful in general. And, I know this was a different time and everything, but St. Paul, man, he really just gets right to the point. St. Paul writes, man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have any authority over a man. She must be silent. If there is anything a woman desires to know, let her ask her husband at home. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And it was not the man who was deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became the sinner. The Bible, the good book, the good news. I was so disillusioned with the Bible, by the time I finished the epistles, I just didn't think it could get any worse. But it did. We were just about to read the last and most oddball book of the Bible, Revelation. Now, apparently Revelation was written by St. John, the same person who wrote a gospel and some of the epistles. The biblical historian Ken Smith says that if his epistles can be seen as John on pot, well, Revelation is John on acid. It describes the end of days with a little too much gruesome enthusiasm. Revelation tells us that in heaven there is a throne, and the one who sat there had the appearance of a jasper. Around the throne are 4 living creatures, and they're covered with eyes, front and back. Day and night they never stop saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. In heaven, Jesus resembles a dead lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes. And when the gates of hell are open, locusts pour out with human faces wearing tiny crowns, and they sting people with their tails. Revelation tells us that only 144,000 people will be saved and even get into heaven, and that none of them will have, quote, defiled themselves with women. Which I guess excludes most heterosexual men from heaven. And depending on how you interpret that word defiled, I don't know, I would say it excludes all women too. After we finished Revelation, the entire Bible study group sat there, dumbfounded, our Bibles on our laps. Father Tom said, Revelation's a poem about the end of the world? I said, Father Tom, I am having a really hard time with this book. And he told me to pray for faith. I left the church thinking, is this one big practical joke? Where is my God, the Jesus I know, the one that I love and the one who loves me? I was driving home and I was stopped at a red light on Crenshaw and Wilshire, and it was a Sunday, and all these people were walking to church holding their Bibles, and I wanted to roll down the window and say, have you read that book? I mean, really? I felt like I was in a horror film, and the clue to the insanity was not some secret document. It was a book that everyone was holding, that was on every coffee table, the biggest bestseller of all time, the key to the underpinnings of the faith, in every single hotel room in the land. And yet, if you cared enough to just glance inside, you found you'd open the door to an insane asylum with a bunch of crazy people dancing around saying, yippity, yippity, yeah! And now I'd shut that door, and how could I pretend that I hadn't opened that door? My mother said, Julie, I just ignore what I don't like. Why would you do something, honey, like go read the Bible cover to cover if you weren't just looking for reasons to get upset? You make your life so much harder than it has to be, honey. Well, I went to Book Soup, and I wandered around, and I saw this book called The History of God by this woman, Karen Armstrong. Karen Armstrong is this amazing British religious writer who was a nun for 7 years, and then she left the convent, and now I believe she teaches religious history at a rabbinical institute in England. In my mind, the Haley Mills character in The Trouble with Angels, well, she grows up to become Karen Armstrong. Karen has all sorts of scathingly brilliant ideas. I loved The History of God, and in it, Karen makes a good point. She says the stories of the Bible are not literally true. Everybody knows they're not literally true, and it's not even important that they're true. What's important is that they're psychologically true. And that was a big revelation for me. I felt like I finally understood, as if at long last I was in on the secret. I thought, oh yeah, that's what everybody already knows, only no one says it. Or maybe this is what Father Tom was trying to tell me when he said myth-ish. He meant it was psychologically true. I walked around thinking, of course, and I remember the nuns teaching me dogma in grade school and how exasperated they would get if I asked too many questions, and now I knew what they were thinking. They were thinking, don't you know it's just psychologically true? Everybody else seems to get that. So when I went to Mass on Easter Sunday that year, I felt I had this new positive attitude. I knew the correct way to look at the stories. Historical accuracy was not important. That people built cultures around them wasn't even important. What was important was that they triggered us somehow very deep in our psyche because they were psychologically true. But as I sat there in Mass, I thought, what does that really mean, psychologically? I mean, Jesus' death and resurrection, death and rebirth, okay, I get it, psychologically true enough. But what about other stories on the same theme? I mean, what about Persephone going down into the underworld? I mean, that's psychologically true too then, I suppose. Or what about stories from the Iliad? Or Darth Vader? Or the little engine that could? I mean, those are psychologically true stories, aren't they? And what's so psychologically true about atonement? We were taught that Jesus died for our sins based on this idea of atonement, or that somebody else can pay for the sins of other people. For the first time, after going to church basically my entire life, I considered the idea that God sent his Son to earth to suffer and die for our sins. Why? I mean, first of all, you can say that Jesus suffered, but he didn't suffer any more than a lot of people have suffered. I could think of examples in my own family. My brother Mike, who had cancer, he suffered unspeakably for a very long time. Eyelids freezing open and his eyes drying up, canker sores all over his throat and he couldn't swallow, weeks and then months of gut-wrenching vomiting and nausea before he finally died. So, okay, Jesus suffered. I mean, he apparently suffered terribly for 1, maybe even 2 days. I heard someone say once, Jesus had a really bad weekend for our sins. I thought, why would a God create people so imperfect, then blame them for their own imperfections? Aha, then send his Son to be tortured and then murdered by those imperfect people to make up for how imperfect people were and how imperfect they inevitably were going to be. I mean, what a crazy idea. I looked at the crucifix, and for the first time, instead of seeing a symbol of transcendence and compassion, I saw a horrible execution device. What kind of God sends his Son to be tortured and killed like that? Oh. I guess it is the God of the Old Testament. That's exactly who would do something like that. But then, when I looked at Jesus as just a guy, just a human, just an impassioned young idealist who, sure, lost his temper a lot, but who could also go on teary-eyed about loving your neighbor and helping the poor. And because his ideas were so outspoken, it threatened those in power who ordered him to be tortured and then killed. And then reading how Jesus died, astonished and heartbroken that his own God abandoned him. His story became so tragic. Jesus' life and death made me want to go out and campaign for free speech, not sit in a church and worship him. So I tried to concentrate on what I did like about the church. The stained glass windows are pretty. The light in the church, the religious art, the songs. Not the words to the songs, exactly, but the melodies were nice, especially at Christmas. It was all so pretty in the church then. Well, Father Tom saw me outside the church. He said, "Happy Easter, Julia." I said, "Happy Easter, Father." He said, "You know, I can see you frowning from the pulpit." "I'm sorry, Father, but will you please help me because I'm just finding this all just impossible to believe." He pulled me over to the coffee and donuts table. He said, "Listen, I've been speaking with some of the other priests about your predicament." I loved how he said predicament. I felt like I was 16 and knocked up. I said, "Yeah?" He said, "Listen, we all struggle with doubt, but we all come back. Just remember Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." So God gave us the gifts of intelligence and curiosity and rationality, but then we're not supposed to use them? Then Father Tom sighed, like he was so tired of me and my struggle. And I was so angry that he used that particular proverb. It really felt like he was just slamming the door in my face. Then all of a sudden, Father Tom started to bless me. It was sort of awkward. He just started moving his hands over me and chanting this phrase in Latin. Not that this is so out of the ordinary or wrong or anything like that. It's just in this moment, it felt like he was trying to perform an exorcism. Afterwards, I went back into the empty church and I sat down and I stared at the altar. When I was 10 or so, the sisters at St. Augustine's announced that anyone who was interested in becoming an altar boy were to go see Monsignor at the rectory. And I thought, I want to be an altar boy. And my best friend Janie Parker and I went up to the rectory and we knocked on the door and Monsignor answered and I said, "We want to be altar boys or altar girls or altar people or whatever." And Monsignor said, "Don't be ridiculous." And he slammed the door in our faces as we stood there. Janie and I were so angry. We were so mad. We just went right back over to the church and we went where they'd always told us we should never go, up to the sanctuary. And we knew that it was a sacrilege to touch anything on the altar if you weren't a priest or an altar boy. And we ran around and touched everything. We touched every little thing. We got our girl cooties all over that altar. And suddenly, remembering that like a big ocean wave, the force of all that I really hated about this church welled up in me. All the pompous, numbing masses, the unabated monotony of the rituals, all the desperate priests trying to tease something meaningful out of a very flawed ancient text. I was driving home going east on the 10, and I was near tears thinking, I tried so hard. I tried to learn more about my church, and it just made everything a lot worse. I thought they knew something I didn't know, like they had to have, because there's this whole huge institution built on it. And I thought, I feel like I am lying under this great huge cow of the church, sucking on a teat, trying to get some milk of meaning. And I am sucking and sucking. And then I usually do get a teaspoon of milk, and I thrill to myself, a teaspoon of meaning, a teaspoon of meaning, hallelujah. And now my neck is so exhausted, and even the muscles in my shoulders and back are starting to ache. And I prayed to God, what am I gonna do? I can't go back there again. We could go to some other church together, me and God, or find some other way, but this is not the right way for me. I will not make this drive again. It is finished. And then I did start to cry, and as if God were crying too, it began to rain. And I could almost feel God sitting in the passenger seat next to me, and we were ripping down the freeway together. And I could practically hear God say, I could barely stand it at that church myself. Let's get the hell out of here. And so we did. I came home, and it felt remarkably quiet. Sort of like God and I were empty nesters, and now we had no church or rituals or special prayers to distract us from each other. It's just me and God, not saying much, just sort of pondering. Not a big conversationalist. God. In retrospect, I could have easily become an Episcopal at that moment, but I didn't. Instead, I went to Rocket Video and I rented all those Bill Moyers, Joseph Campbell tapes, and I rewatched them, and I reveled in the common themes that all religions share. But it was different than the first time I watched them back in 1988. Back then, all I really remembered was follow your bliss, follow your bliss, follow your bliss. And I thought, okay, I'm following my bliss. That's good advice. But this time I thought, you know what? I believe in everything. All religions worship the same God. They just all do it in different ways. I began to drift east, spiritually speaking. I took a meditation class and I began to meditate rather regularly, and I found it challenging and it really sharpened my concentration. I got Houston Smith's Guide to the Spiritual Classics, and I read them all. The Tao Te Ching, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Rumi, the Essential Kabbalah. I was on a spiritual quest. Fortunately, around this time on the work front, I had been cast as the mother in 2 direct-to-video family dog movies, Beethoven 3 and 4. I know I hate to throw my credits around in a shift. Sometimes I have to. Anyway, in one of the scripts, it had this nightmare sequence which involved a bunch of drooling St. Bernards licking my terrified face. And this was accomplished by taking a whole bunch of St. Bernards and not feeding them for a very long time, taking me to the beach and burying me in sand all the way up to my neck, rubbing a bunch of dog food in my hair, and then releasing the hounds. And as the dogs galloped towards my fragrant cranium, I thought, maybe I'm a Buddhist. In a way, it seems inevitable. I mean, I live in California. It's practically Buddhism's second home. I was so excited about Buddhism that I decided I wanted to travel in countries predominantly Buddhist and go to the East and see the places where it all began. And the money from these 2 movies allowed me to do it. I took off and traveled for several months. I went to China and hiked along the Yangtze, and then I went to Tibet, where I went overland from Lhasa to Kathmandu. And then I spent some time hiking in Bhutan, this little Buddhist monarchy high up in the Himalayas. It's sort of sandwiched between India and China. And as I hiked up and up to a monastery, I could hear the monks chanting and singing in the distance. Prayer flags whipped in the wind, and the giant mountains hovered, and it was all so otherworldly and exotic. It also happened to be my 40th birthday. I kept thinking 40. Wow, 40. I always thought that by this age I'd be married and have kids, maybe even grown kids. I could almost hear God laughing in the wind at how differently everything turned out for me. Ahead of me on the trail was this old man carrying a prayer wheel and one of those rosaries of prayer beads that has the same number of beads that Catholics use, a mala, I think it's called. And I thought, wow, see, he looked like he could almost be my grandmother walking to church. I got closer to the monastery, but as I got closer, I could see how young some of the monks were. It's a tradition in places like Tibet and Bhutan that the second son just automatically goes into the monastery. Some of the boys are as young as 7, the age of reason, but hardly an age where someone can make an informed decision about their life purpose. I mean, they would only get a religious education. They would never get to experience, a heterosexual relationship with its particular joys and sorrows, or a family of their own. Instead of being inspired by them, I wanted to free them. And as I hiked back down, I thought, maybe I have it backwards. Maybe we don't all worship the same God. I mean, after all, the Buddhist gods are so different than the Judeo-Christian God, but we all sure seem to worship them in the same ways. We recite prayers, we make sacrifices, we wear special garments, we use special objects. From there, I went to Thailand, where I happened to talk to this woman who was taking care of a terribly deformed boy who was an orphan. And I said, it's so good of you to take care of this poor boy. And she said, don't say poor boy. He must have done something terrible in a past life to be born like that. When I got back to Los Angeles, even though there was still a lot about Buddhism that truly did intrigue me, I had to admit I was less interested. I kept thinking, wow, the Buddhism we get in California is all cleaned up for us. And I wondered what enlightenment really meant. I felt pretty good about my levels of attachment and detachment to the world. To me, life was not all suffering. In fact, what I mostly felt was this growing sense of outrageous luck. And And I realized that I wasn't just looking for inner peace so that I could feel happier or more content with my own life. I was trying to figure out why I was born, who God was, and I guess what the ultimate meaning of life was. Well, Bill Moyers was to appear once again on my quest, not exactly as a spiritual guide showing me down the right road, but more like a friendly gas station attendant who has some pretty good maps for sale next to the cash register. He did this interview with Sister Wendy. Do you know Sister Wendy? She is that nun who is on PBS all the time, walking through museums, talking rapturously about art. I love Sister Wendy. To me, she has the perfect dream life. Half the year she spends in a silent monastery, and the other half she spends being a television star. I've watched all of her videos, and Bill Moyers did this special interview with her. He did ask her question after question after question about her sexless existence, which got to be rather annoying and then even a little disturbing. But at one point he said to her, "Sister Wendy, when you're at the monastery, what do you do all day?" And Sister Wendy said, "Well, Bill, I pray a lot, and I live in the sunshine of God's presence. It's absolute bliss." And I thought, the sunshine of God's presence, huh? The sunshine of God's presence. Maybe I'll spend more time in the sunshine. Maybe for me, God is nature, the beauty and harmony of our natural world. And as soon as I said it, it felt so right. I could almost hear God saying, duh. And I walked around saying, God is nature, God is nature. That's the way for me to connect with God, by spending time in his masterpiece, nature. Now, you know, Catholics don't push nature all that much either. I think there's something almost pornographic about the whole idea of nature to Catholics. I don't remember a lot of hiking growing up. We weren't like those crazy Protestants who were out camping all the time. I guess the idea was that nature was just so lush and unabashedly ripe, you just didn't know what you were going to get tangled up in out in nature. So I decided that I would try to experience God while I was on a hike or on a bike. And it was fun. It was really fun. And I began to notice the smallest leaves and what a web of life there was out there, so intricate and beautiful. I was able to continue my travels, and this time I headed to South America, and I went to Ecuador and then went to visit the Galapagos Islands. I went on a week-long boat trip with a naturalist and 8 other people. And in the common area of the boat was Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. And I laughed when I saw it because I thought, either you would be someone who would have already read The Origin of Species, and that would be why you even came here to the Galapagos, or you would be someone who would probably never read The Origin of Species. I mean, how supremely dorky would it be if someone saw this book here and thought, I wonder what this is about, and started reading it here of all places? That would be so ridiculous. And in a few moments, I basically was that person. Now, of course, I accepted the theory of evolution. I mean, I remembered Sister Charitina telling us all about it in 8th grade, how we, as Catholics, believe in evolution. We weren't like some of those uneducated Protestants that believe God literally plopped people onto the earth in one fell swoop. She said, this is the way it happened. God set everything in motion in order for humans to evolve. Then there was a special preordained moment when there was the very, very first human man and woman. Because think about it. There had to be some moment when there was the very, very first human man and woman, and that was Adam and Eve. And that's when God put a soul in us. And then everything else happened exactly as it says in the Bible. And then she sort of encouraged us not to think so much about evolution anymore, because after all, she had just explained it. Right? In any case, the idea of evolution wasn't threatening to me in any way. It's just, I didn't really understand that much about it, except over time, animals change. I thought The Origin of Species would be way too scientific of a book for a person like me to read. Personally, I had avoided science at all costs in school. In fact, I even had this prejudice, this idea that doing well at science was somehow an admission that you didn't have the complexity of character, the subtlety of mind to take on the humanities. Science was for people who couldn't handle ambiguities, who needed black and white answers, probably people who couldn't really get in touch with their feelings and had nothing left to think about. But to my surprise, The Origin of Species was very easy to read and truly a page-turner. And Charles Darwin, he described evolution in ways that Sister Charitina had not. It was a lot more scary and chancy the way Darwin described it. The next day, we visited an island where the blue-footed boobies were tending to their new babies. Now, the blue-footed boobies are just the cutest animals in the world, I think almost to the level of absurdity. They have this bright white fur that sticks out all over, and these big blue beaks and feet, and these huge plaintive eyes. Now, usually the blue-footed boobies have just one baby per pregnancy, but every once in a while they have two, and when they do, usually the stronger of the two pecks the brains out of the weaker one. So we were all looking at these adorable little blue-footed booby babies, and then we came upon one pecking the brains out of its weaker sibling. And the naturalist was telling us that this was routine, that now the frigate bird would fly in soon and carry the dead baby off to feed its family. That's the way it went. And I looked at this poor, doomed, blue-footed booby baby with his brains just hanging out of his head. And we looked each other in the eye for a moment, and he looked at me like, "What are you gonna do?" "I'm the weaker blue-footed booby baby." Oh, God. God is not nature. God is not nature. Nature is floods and famines and earthquakes and viruses and little blue-footed booby babies getting their brains pecked out by their stronger sibling. God, the God that I know, the God of love and compassion, that isn't exactly found in nature. We went back to the boat, and clouds formed overhead, and I decided I would just lie in the fetal position for a while and consider nature. So God and nature are separate. Oh, it is so obvious that that is true. I mean, God is a moral force, and nature is utterly amoral. I mean, nature doesn't care about me or anybody in particular. I mean, nature can be terrifying. Gosh, why do they even put words like natural on products like shampoo? Like, that's automatically a good thing. I mean, sulfuric acid is natural. I could almost hear God saying, duh. But then God, who are you? Because I can't stop thinking lions and tigers and bears, oh my. If I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall not fear, because you are with me. Maybe God is love. I mean, could it be that simple for me? You hear it all the time, God is love. Okay, God is love. God is a force of love. God is a force of love in the universe. When I was in high school at Marycliff, the Catholic girls' school, there was this lay teacher who taught PE named Ms. Roberts, and she was gorgeous. She walked like an athlete, her head held high. She was tall and blonde and muscular, a goddess in our midst. One day, the nuns had all of us girls in the gym, and we were sitting on the floor listening to this guest musician, who I think may have been a friend of Ms. Roberts, and he was playing his guitar and singing. And at the end of his set, he began singing this song, Vatican Rag, which is very irreverent and has lyrics like, bow your head with great respect, and then genuflect, genuflect, genuflect. Well, the nuns reeled. Sister Mary Howard stood up in the middle of his song and asked him to leave. He stopped, took his guitar, and left. Then I remember just sitting there in the gym for a while, just sort of decompressing, just talking about God. When all of a sudden, Sister Mary Howard turned to this Miss Roberts and said, "Do you even believe in God?" Well, I'd never heard anyone ask another person a question like that before. Ms. Roberts stared right into the eyes of Sister Mary Howard, and Sister Mary Howard stared right into the eyes of Ms. Roberts, who after an eternity said, "I believe in a force of love in the universe." All of us girls nodded in agreement. Force of love in the universe? I mean, sure, who could argue with that? And then we all looked back at Sister Mary Howard, whose eyes narrowed, like, that is the wrong answer. Only 2 years later, the attitude of my church towards God being simply love had completely changed. Gonzaga Prep, the Catholic boys' school, had gone co-ed, and that's where I spent my last 2 years of high school. Everything seemed to be changing. Folk masses were slipping into the mainstream. Some of the priests used chalices made of thick handmade pottery, and their vestments were made out of unbleached fabrics, coarsely woven. And instead of the pre-made communion wafers, we all just started breaking a loaf of bread into little pieces, like Jesus did. In the spring, Father Fitterer started teaching us all transcendental meditation. Suddenly, there were guitars in Mass and a drum set right up on the altar. Transubstantiation was never like this before. In my senior year of high school, they had us all go on this special retreat called a search, and they took us off to this retreat house for a couple of days up in the mountains, and they put these big blankets over the windows so we didn't know what time it was, and then they didn't let us sleep for 2 entire days. And of course, everyone kept breaking down and crying, saying, "God is love! God is love!" Only we were actually saying, "Fred is love, Fred is love." Because they asked us to call God Fred instead of God while we were on the retreat. Because they felt the name God was just too off-putting for so many people, and Fred just felt so much friendlier. So we were saying, "Fred is love. I am walking on Fred's path." I remember after the search, all of us seniors were going back to school in this bus down these really scary, winding switchback roads. And another senior, Larry, who a few years later would leave the Catholic Church to become an evangelical Christian, turned to me with this big beatific grin on his face and he said, "Just think, if this bus got into a big accident right now, we were all killed, we'd all probably go straight up to heaven." And we all nodded like, "Yeah, our souls are so clean and pure at this moment. How wonderful would it be if we were all killed in a big bus accident right now, because we'd all fly straight up to Fred." This is how I danced in high school. I didn't really date in high school. So here I was, years and years later, saying God is love again myself. But what did I mean exactly? I decided I would think more about this whole idea of God being love, the feeling of love. Did I think there was a God behind it? Or in it? I mean, there seemed to be a lot of incentive to feel love just for its own sake. Without God, would there be no love? In my confusion, I found someone who made it clear, someone who had thought about this topic a lot. Now, at this point, I knew a little bit of science, but not a lot, and that made me the perfect candidate for Deepak Chopra. I read The Way of the Wizard, Ageless Body, Timeless Mind, The Quantum Alternative to Growing Old, The 7 Spiritual Laws of Success, and How to Know God. I basked my way through Deepak's books. I thought, I get it. God is energy and intention in the quantum field or something. Deepak says that by perceiving changelessness, time ceases to exist. I love Deepak. I did an interview on The View on ABC, and Deepak Chopra also happened to be a guest on the exact same show, and I gushed all over him in the green room, telling him how wonderful he was. I did notice that he looked a little older than he looked on his book jacket, and I wondered if his perceived timelessness was working on his own body. I told him how his books were helping me understand what and who God was, what ultimate reality was, and also, I just had to tell him that I appreciated that he also had books about how to create spontaneous wealth and how to lose weight. Deepak says, "The world is the creation of the observer, and the body is information and energy spanning the universe. Consciousness is the ground of all being. It created us, and we are part of it." Deepak believes that we can tap into this big consciousness with our awareness, and that it is the source of all creativity and intention and synchronicity. And if you want proof, well, the exotic field of quantum mechanics proves all of it. I was really enthralled with how Deepak was using science, the cutting-edge science of quantum mechanics. This was so much better than using myths and superstitions to find spirituality. I mean, this was using physics and science to find spirituality. I was so intrigued with this quantum mechanics that Deepak refers to over and over and over again in his books that I decided I would take a class in it. And what I found is that Deepak Chopra is full of shit. Oh. I wanted to go back in time, and instead of gushing at Chopra, I wanted to say, Deepak, what the hell are you doing? There is no universal consciousness that can be demonstrated with quantum mechanics. There is no healing of the body or arresting of the aging process through telepathy. I mean, sure, subatomic waves and particles do behave in perplexing and strange ways to us, especially when we try to measure them, apparently. But that doesn't mean that there are angels or that the universe wants me in particular to make more money. I mean, I know this, and I took one measly class. I turned on the TV one day to find Deepak back on his beloved show, The View, promoting his new book, Golfing to Enlightenment. And all the ladies were so thrilled. Who knew you could achieve enlightenment on the links? I started feeling so angry at the New Age movement, so arrogant, so clueless. I mean, here was the generation that was supposed to be the best educated, the ones who threw off the shackles of superstition and traditional religion, and then what did they do? They just gravitated towards chakras and auras and crystals and quantum consciousness. I mean, what is the matter with people? And then I thought, oh, God, what is happening to me? I'm becoming so cantankerous. I'm going to become one of those angry retired people who just keeps writing letters to the editor. And I realized that the class I took didn't just give me a very rudimentary understanding of the very basics of quantum mechanics. I actually learned something much more deeply disturbing about myself, which was I'd never really been taught critical thinking skills before. I never really considered how to evaluate evidence. I always thought that being smart meant that you knew a lot of things, or that you did what the teacher told you to do really, really well. Not that you had this mechanism for filtering information. Plus, the truth was, I was starting to get nervous about my relationship with God. I felt like we were this married couple in trouble, just trying to find some common ground. I began to wonder just who I was married to. How defined did it really need to be for me? Because the truth was, God worked for me. William James said, "It doesn't work because it's true because it works." When I prayed, I felt calmer, more focused. It really changed my state of mind. But just because the idea of God worked so well for me, it didn't necessarily mean that he existed. I felt suspicious. For the first time, I wondered if God wasn't just my imaginary friend. As they say, the invisible and the non-existent often look very much alike. Then I thought, well, wait a minute, God requires faith, and faith does not require evidence, right? But the more I thought about it, the more I had to admit that my faith really was based on evidence. The evidence of how I felt when I prayed. The evidence of everyone believing in God, almost everyone I ever met from the time I was a kid. The evidence of what I had been taught by people that I trusted and admired, and people who ultimately had authority over me. So my faith in God really was based on evidence. How could I not examine that evidence? But then, how did I examine anything? How did I even know what I knew? I had to know. One day, I was thinking about these things while I was wandering around Auntie's bookstore in Spokane, Washington, and I glanced up and I saw this book called How the Mind Works by this guy, Steven Pinker. And I thought, wow, how does the mind work anyway? Turns out, dendrites and neurons and glial cells and spindle cells. I mean, apparently the nature of consciousness is still mysterious in some respects, but basically we're talking about neurons firing through dendrites, often releasing chemicals in our bodies. Reading how the mind works triggered this appetite inside me for understanding how we understand, how we function, and what we really know. And I was surprised to find that all of our brains are on drugs all of the time. We give ourselves hits: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, vasopressin. The next time all of you laugh, I'll get a little shot of adrenaline through my veins. And if you don't when I expect you to, I'll get cortisol instead and feel anxious. Thank you, by the way. Woo! I always thought that I was a person who had escaped addictions, but I realize that I am up here on this stage right now partly because I am an addict. Also, I learned that memory is very, very unreliable, even when we think we remember for sure. It turns out our memories are not automatic video playbacks, but instead reconstructions. Our memories get filtered by our prior prejudices and then mixed up with things that happen later. And that was a very scary thought for me because my memories, that makes me who I am. When I think of myself as my innermost being, I don't think of it as a body function. My brain creates this idea that myself is not itself. I think of myself as something separate, looking out from my eyes, listening through my ears, pulling the strings that make my body move. And that is because the brain is not able to perceive its own functioning. And this is true for all of us, by the way, right from childhood. When a child is told that it's their brain that thinks, they don't think their brain is them. They think their brain is this thinking, computing machine, something that is added to their self to help them understand things. And yet, the mind is what the brain does, just like pumping blood is what the heart does. Reading about the brain opened this door in my interest that I never even knew existed. I was catapulted into a binge of reading. I was voracious. It was like I had been starved my entire life for science, like the Cambrian explosion happened in my own brain. And I liked it. It was challenging. And unlike every other knowledge quest, this one actually got better the closer you looked. For the first time, knowing too much didn't ruin it. I always thought that science was this set of immutable facts revealed to us by nature. And then when I would read, as a layperson about how, say, a planet was now not a planet anymore, or gravity wasn't like we thought, I always thought that was a failing of science, another sign at how completely unsure science was. But I realized these examples were not signs of weakness, they were signs of strength, that the method was working, constantly filtering new and even better information. I had it all backwards when I was younger. It's actually the scientists who are good at dealing with uncertainty. Well, I was dating a guy at this time who was a big believer in intelligent design. Intelligent design is this idea that the world is so complex, especially the conscious, thinking, feeling human being who is so complicated that it just couldn't have happened by chance. Someone or something had to have a hand in creating us, and that someone or something is God. The watch requires a watchmaker. Well, one morning, my intelligent designer boyfriend and I were waking up, and he glanced at the books on my side of the bed, which were becoming increasingly more biological rather than religious. And then we gazed into each other's eyes, deeper than ever before. It's the human eye, he said. That's the proof there must have been a designer. You can't have half an eye. Half an eye's no good at all. Either you have an eye so you can see, or you don't. How could you possibly evolve an eye? Yes, I said, that's probably true. The eye is very complex. After all, it's the window into the soul. So I began to read about eyes. I learned a lot more than I ever dreamed about eyes. Turns out from an evolutionary perspective, the human eye is perfectly explainable. What began as a patch of skin, more sensitive to light than other skin, offers some advantage. Those that have it live, those that don't do not. Turns out half an eye actually is pretty valuable. About half as valuable. Now, if an intelligent designer or God designed our eyes, he would not get such a very good grade because he put the blood vessels and nerves that carry all the visual information to the brain on top of the retina. Imagine, that's like putting all the wiring of a video camera on top of the lens. And where the blood vessels and nerves go through our retina into our brain, it causes us to have this blind spot that we all compensate for by basically hallucinating, which is bad, 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 not a good design for an eye, and it doesn't even have to be that way. Octopus and squid, they evolved their eyes separately from us, and they don't have those annoying features. The wonderful biologist, Massimo Pigliucci, he wrote, the only possible conclusions that we can come to from this evidence are that God didn't design the eye, or he did, and he's pretty sloppy and not worthy of our unconditional admiration, or God likes squids a lot better than humans. Intelligent design gets everything backwards. It's like saying that our hands are miraculous because they fit so perfectly into our gloves. Look at that, 4 fingers and a thumb. Now that can't have been an accident. My old cat Rita lumbered onto my lap while I was reading about eyes. She was about 15 years old then and had gotten too tired and bothered to go through the entire meow. She just started going, meh, We looked each other in the eye. Instead of noticing the differences, I noticed the similarities. We inherited our eyes from our common ancestor who probably lived around 100 million years ago. Our eyes are forward on our skull because we are hunters. Except, well, Rita wasn't much of a hunter. And I realized neither was I. Not if I was dating a guy who was so into intelligent design. Rita meowed at me like, who needs to hunt when I have domestic help? Then I started reading about all of these experiments on the function of the temporal lobes. These doctors figured out a way to stimulate electromagnetically the right temporal lobe. People who wore this helmet experienced a transcendent sense of understanding, an overwhelming connectedness and peace, and sometimes the presence of God or of aliens. This was often accompanied by a bright white light. Everyone has a certain right temporal lobe sensitivity. We're all susceptible to these types of experiences. So this could have been what was happening to me when I had that whole heal me experience. Of course, this doesn't mean that God doesn't just use this physical way to allow us to experience him, or her, or whoever. But that sure was interesting. I learned that because the brain is in some deep, fundamental ways unaware of itself, hallucinations like I had, or like that people have of angels or ghosts or out-of-body or near-death experiences, are perceived as real events or actual encounters. And so most people, including me, just instinctively think of the mind as something separate from the body, even though there's no evidence that they are separate. It turns out we are organic beings in essence, our minds living and dying along with our bodies, and sometimes even before our bodies, as it takes just one visit with a person with Alzheimer's to realize. So my common sense view of the world can be very mistaken. My instincts tell me one thing, like that the earth is flat because, it basically seems to be while I'm walking around on it. But the earth isn't flat, as the facts show us. I suddenly realized that there were implications to everything that I was learning. My assumption about God's role in our lives was really getting squeezed. I didn't think he intervened in our lives. I didn't think he was necessary for us to evolve. I tried not to think of the implications, but come on, it was impossible not to. Then one day, I was commenting out my tub, and I thought, what if it's true? What if humans are here because of pure random chance? What if there is no guiding hand, no external regulation, no one watching? It's clearly possible that this may be true. In fact, this is what our scientific evidence is pointing towards. But if it were true, what would that mean? I realized I had spent so much time thinking about what God meant that I hadn't really spent any time thinking about what not God meant. A few days later, I was walking from my office in my backyard into the house, and I suddenly realized that there was this teeny-weeny voice whispering inside my head. I'm not sure how long it had been there, but it suddenly got just 1 decibel louder, and it whispered, "There is no God." I tried to ignore it, but it got a little louder. There is no God. There is no God. Oh my God, there is no God. I sat down under my barren apricot tree. I didn't realize, by the way, that trees are like people. They stop reproducing when they get older. Maybe that fig tree that Jesus condemned to death was just menopausal. Anyway, I sat there and I thought, okay, I admit it. I do not believe that there is enough evidence to continue to believe in God. I mean, the world behaves exactly as you would expect it would if there were no supreme being, no supreme consciousness, no supernatural. So my best judgment tells me that it's much more likely that we invented God rather than God inventing us. And I shuddered. I felt like I was slipping off the raft. I thought, but I can't not believe in God. I need God. I mean, we have a whole history together. And then I thought, wait a minute. if I look over my life, every single step of maturing for me, every single one, has really had the exact same common denominator. And that was accepting what was true over what I wished were true. I mean, this was the case about guys, about my career, about my parents. So how could I come up against this biggest question, the ultimate question, if I really believed in God or not, and then just turn away from the evidence? How could I believe just because I wanted to? How would I have any respect for myself if I did that? I thought of Pascal's wager. Pascal argued that it's better to bet there is a God, because if you're wrong, there's nothing to lose. But if there is, you win an eternity in heaven. But I can't force myself to believe just in case it turns out to be true. I mean, the God I've been praying to knows what I think. He doesn't just make sure I show up for church. How could I possibly pretend to believe? I mean, I might be able to convince other people, but surely not God. And plus, if I lead my life according to my own deeply held moral principles, what difference did it make if I believed in God or not? And why would God care exactly that I believed in him? And then I thought, but I don't know how to not believe in God. I don't know how you do it. How do you get up? How do you get through the day? And then I thought, okay, calm down. Let's just put on the not believing in God glasses for a moment, just for a second. Just put on the no God glasses, take a quick glance around, and then immediately throw them off. And I put them on, and I looked around. I'm embarrassed to report, I initially felt dizzy. I actually had the thought, how does the Earth stay up in the sky? You mean we're just hurtling through space? That's so vulnerable. And I wanted to run out and catch the Earth as it fell out of space into my hands. And then I thought, oh yeah, gravity and angular momentum are going to keep us revolving around the sun for probably a really long time. And then I thought, well, what's going to stop me from just rushing out and murdering people? And I had to walk myself through it. Why? Are we ethical? Well, because we have to be. We're social animals. We are extremely complex social animals, and we evolved this moral sense, like an aversion to random murder, in order for communities to exist, because communities help us survive better and in much bigger numbers. And then eventually we codified these internal ethics that evolved inside of us into laws against things like wanton murder. So I guess that's why I won't be just rushing out and murdering people. And then suddenly, I felt so guilty, like I cheated on God somehow just by having all of these thoughts. And I ran into the house and I prayed and I asked God to please help me have faith. But already it felt slightly silly and vacant. And I felt like I was just talking to myself. And I thought, okay, I'll just not believe in God for 1 hour a day and see how things go. So the next day I tried it again. And I thought, wait a minute. What about all those people who are like unjustifiably jailed somewhere horrible, and they're like in solitary confinement, and all they do is pray? This means that I think those people are praying to nobody? Is that possible? And then I thought, we better get those people out of jail, because no one's looking out for them but us. There is no God hearing their pleas. And I guess that goes for really poor people too, and really oppressed people who I had this vague idea that they had a God to comfort them, and then an even vaguer idea that God had orchestrated their lot for some unknowable grand design. I walked around thinking, oh, no one is minding the store. And I wondered how traffic worked, how we all just run in chaos all the time. And slowly, I began to see the world completely differently. It's like I had to rethink what I thought about everything. It's like I had to go change the wallpaper of my mind. Eventually, I was able to say goodbye to God, and I imagined this old guy, this old man, more like a broken down version of the God on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But if you look closely, you could even see the Jesus from the poster in my high school bedroom. But older, much older, with long gray and white hair and lots of lines on his face. An old hippie who still smoked. And at one time, he seemed so all-powerful and all-knowing and all-protective. And now, He just seemed a little stinky. And I could just see him sitting on his suitcases near the front door of my house. And I went to him and said, "I'm sorry, God. It's not you. It's me. It's just, I don't think you exist. I mean, God, look at it this way. It's really because I take you so seriously that I can't bring myself to believe in you. If it's any consolation, it's sort of a sign of respect. So sit here for a while if you want to. Stay a little bit if you need to. There's no big hurry." And slowly, over the course of several weeks, he just disappeared. Looking back on it, I think I just walked around in a daze for a few months. My mind became such a private place. I realized that I had shared my mind with a God my entire life, and I suddenly realized that my thoughts were completely my own. No one was monitoring them. No one was compassionately listening to them. My thoughts were my own private affair and something no one but me knew about. And I had so much thinking to do. One day, I was walking along Larchmont Boulevard, this busy shopping area near my house, and I was lost in thought thinking, so then I guess I don't think anything happens to us after we die. Consciousness fades and stops like every other organ, so people just die. And then I thought, wait a minute. So Hitler just died? Nobody sat him down and said, "You screwed up, buddy, and now you're going to spend an eternity in a fiery hell." So Hitler just died. We better make sure that never happens again. And my brother Mike, this means that he just died. I always had this idea that Mike's death, while premature, was his divine destiny somehow, and that his spirit didn't really die, but it lived on, not just in the memory of those that knew him, but in a real, tangible sense. And I realized that I now thought he died. He really died, and he was gone forever. And then I realized I had to go back and basically kill off everyone I ever met who died, who I guess I didn't think really died. And then I thought, oh, I get it. So I'm going to die. So I'm going to die. And I sat down on a bench and I watched people bustling by and I thought, wow, life is so cheap and so precious. So I'm just another animal on Earth, just a type of primate, the third chimpanzee, better at using tools and able to talk. And then I am going to die. And there will be eons of time when I will not exist, just like the eons of time before I did. I'm in my 40s, about halfway through my life, I hope. At this moment, the sun and the earth and I are all middle-aged, just an animal on a planet in a solar system, nothing special. But then I think about it this way. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and for the first billion years on Earth, there was no life at all, nothing. And for the next 3 billion years, there was just algae and archaeobacteria, dull green and brown primordial slime for 3 billion years. And then just 500 million years ago or so, boom, complex life came on the scene. Plants and animals, including us, who've been around for what? 100,000 years to 1,000,000 years or so, depending on what you consider to be human. I mean, if Genesis is a metaphor for creation, that metaphor is way off. God would not be creating man on the 6th day, but like the 6,000th day. And all of humanity would have been here for less than a minute. Actually, less than a second. Adam and Eve are just blinking their eyes, barely awake. So if you think about it, even if simple life exists readily all over the universe, it could be that any type of complex life is fairly rare. And then when you think how eyes have evolved over and over again, or how flying has evolved over and over again, but a species with a brain like ours, able to use language and tools the way we do, well, that's happened only once in 4.5 billion years on Earth. I mean, it's not so improbable as to be impossible given all the time involved and all the different ways that species have come up with to try to adapt. But still, it's got to be pretty rare for animals like us to turn up. And in my DNA is a history of this life on Earth, not just back to the African Pliocene, but even farther back to when we crawled out of the pond. And then even farther back from that, when there were only single-celled organisms, all told in the cells of my own body. And to think that I get to live at a time when I can know and understand that, it makes me feel so lucky. Then I started thinking about all the little happenstances, all the random little moves which resulted in me being alive, me in particular at this very moment, not just of my parents' meeting, but even of the millions of sperm against the hundreds of possible eggs. I thought about this randomness multiplying, my parents, their parents, Tom meeting Marie in Yakima, or Henrietta meeting Will on that cruise to Cuba, and then their parents and their parents and their parents, and all the ways it could have gone one way, but it went the way it went, and all the possible people who could just as easily be here in my place. Richard Dawkins wrote, "Certainly those unborn ghosts include poets greater than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. But in the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I, in our ordinariness, that are here." I suddenly felt very deeply that I was alive with my own particular thoughts and my own particular story in this itty-bitty splash of time. And in that splash of time, I get to think about things and do stuff and love people and walk along Larchmont Boulevard with my coffee if I want to, and then that's it. I walked to my car and I had a ticket. My time had expired. And I got in the car and I turned on the radio and there was that old Peggy Lee song. It used to be my mom's favorite. And I suddenly had this memory of us in the kitchen and that song coming on the radio and my mother flipping hamburgers and dancing around the kitchen, taking care of all of her kids.
So there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball. If that's all there is.
I went to Spokane to visit my parents. My dad walked to church every single morning to Lourdes Cathedral for their 6:30 a.m. Mass, and then he took the bus back home. On days that I was in town, I always went with him. My dad was really fun to walk to church with. He had this special way of walking downtown that took him past his favorite store windows, and he could see if they changed things. On the bus ride home, we would usually muse over the wording of certain prayers or recitations in the Mass. My dad loved it when the priest said, "Satan, who prowls through the world for the ruin of souls." We both agreed that it was that word prowls that made that phrase just perfect. Later that day, I told my parents that I'd stopped believing in God. They just looked at me blankly. Sometimes I feel so sorry for my parents to have me as a kid. Sometimes I feel so thankful that my parents had a lot of kids. My mother said, "This doesn't mean that you've stopped going to church now, does it?" I suddenly felt so guilty about this religion, my parents' religion, this religion that they had given us kids, which I was now basically handing back to them. I went to a conference in Washington, D.C., put on by the Center for Inquiry, this nonprofit group that promotes science and critical thinking. A lot of people spoke at the conference, and then I got to give a speech too, which included my views on God, and the Associated Press covered it. And the Wire story was picked up by my hometown paper, Spokane, where I'd recently hosted the Catholic Charities Luncheon, where I'd spoken repeatedly at my Catholic high school, and where my parents took such pride in their Catholicism and in their children, and who I believe now in retrospect felt that my Catholicism was what connected me to my hometown, to my social class, and to them, in spite of having moved so far away. So one day, weeks and weeks after this speech, and without me even knowing that this article even existed out there, my parents got up and went out to get their morning paper. And there I was in the back of the front section, a big picture of me, and in bold letters in huge type, it said, "Sweeney loses her religion." And the first two sentences of the article were, "Julia Sweeney has come out of the closet, period, as an atheist, period." It was the local angle, and they led with that. And then the article went on and talked about the conference in general and barely even mentioned me again. Well, the first call I got from my mother was really more of a scream. "Atheist! Atheist!" My father got on the phone and said, "You have betrayed your family, your school, and your city." It was like I'd sold secrets to the Russians or something. They both said that they were not going to speak to me anymore. My dad said, "I don't even think you should come to my funeral." After I hung up, I thought, just try and stop. Now, I think my parents had been mildly disappointed when I told them I didn't believe in God anymore, but being an atheist was another thing altogether. Frankly, I had not even described myself as an atheist, but I suppose I am one. I don't live my life under the assumption that there is a God, so I guess that makes me an atheist. Atheist, non-theist, but I like the word naturalist more. To me, atheist describes me on religious turf. I believe in a wholly natural universe, and that makes religious people, in my mind, a naturalist. Anyway, several weeks went by, and there was no contact at all from my parents. Now, this was a huge deal. I mean, I usually spoke to my parents several times a week. And then one day, out of the blue, I got this phone call from my mother on her cell phone, and she said, "Julie, I just got out of the foot doctor, and he..." There was a pause. She'd forgotten she wasn't speaking to me anymore. That began a series of sporadic phone calls that I would get from my mother, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. Once at like 5:30 in the morning, the phone rang, and I picked it up, and my mother said, "Why can't you just say you're still searching?" I said, "Well, I am searching, if what you mean by searching is a continual yearning to understand better. But when it comes to God, don't you just have to decide for yourself at one point or another? I mean, the way you look at the world if you believe in God is so different than the way you look at the world if you don't." And she said, "Well, then why do you have to tell people about it? Everybody knows that there are those few people out there who don't believe in God, but they keep it quietly to themselves. Last night, your father said he even wishes you'd announced you were gay. At least that's socially acceptable." To my parents, it was like I was rejecting them personally, or like saying that I wasn't Irish anymore, or worse, that I wasn't American anymore. Once I picked up the phone and my mother said, "Where do you get your peace?" And I repressed the urge to be sarcastic. I said, "Well, I guess I do have less peace. I mean, I don't think everything works out for the best, or there's some big grand plan. I don't think everything happens for a reason other than a tangible, actual reason. And the sad things in life, well, they seem even sadder. But I don't know, I guess I just learned how to live with it." And my mother said, "Oh, Julie, I just want you to be happy. Aren't you just depressed all the time?" And I said, "No, it's kind of turned out to be the opposite for me. The smallest things in life just seem astounding to me now. I'll look at a bridge and I'll think, hey, we figured out how to make that bridge. Look at all the knowledge that we've accumulated." Or like I used to think, there are no coincidences. And now I think, there are coincidences. Wow, coincidences. I mean, Mom, if this is all there is, everything means more, not less, right? Eventually, my dad called me and he said, "Listen, it's all right. I disagree with you, but I am proud of you for saying what you really think, even though I think Satan might be prowling the world for the ruin of your soul." He said, "Oh, maybe he's just sauntering." And he said, "Lurking." And I said, "Meandering?" And he said, "But with a sinister intent." I said, "Oh, Dad, now I need to tell you and Mom something truly important. Can you get Mom on the other line?" And my mother got on and said, "Now what? I'm afraid." And I said, "Mom and Dad, I'm about to have a baby." And my mother said, "But you can't have children." And my dad said, "And you aren't married." And I said, "Mom and Dad, it's a miracle." little girl from China. Her name is Mulan. Lots and lots of people told me how she was destined to be my daughter by the universe and how God had planned our union. But frankly, it's a lot more meaningful to me that out of all the kids who just as easily could have been mine, it's us who ended up together. Here she is in the vastness of all space and time, my kid. Mulan just so happens to be beautiful. After one party where people were just fawning all over her, as we drove home, I said, well, you're very pretty. You're not going to have to develop a personality like your mother had to. One person said, she's so beautiful. When you look at her, you just know there is a God. And I thought, because if she were ugly, then there would be no God? Of course, my parents were immediately in the thrall of Mulan, and having her allowed us all to have this whole other wonderful relationship together. My father started calling Mulan his little pal, just what he called me when I was a kid, and the two of them would take naps together on his bed, and it was hard to tell which of them was snoring louder. My father was ill. He had emphysema, and as the doctors predicted, it was getting worse and worse. He also had heart problems and diabetes. A lifetime of smoking and drinking were finally exacting their price. At the same time, although admittedly not on the same level of concern, my cat Rita was also very ill. An old-age thyroid condition had whittled her from a high weight of 21 pounds down to 6. She stopped grooming herself and started to lie around all day in just one little spot on the rug. It was like she was an old lady in a stained housecoat with curlers in her hair saying, "I don't give a shit how I look anymore." It's like, oh God. My father got weaker and weaker, and eventually he had to be on oxygen 24 hours a day at the highest potency. Mulan and I started to fly up to Spokane every single month to see him. Soon, he couldn't leave the condo at all, and his whole world became about listening to his old Bob and Ray tapes, listening to NPR, and watching reruns of As Time Goes By on PBS. It was hard to tell if it was truly near the end or not. In fact, we had been expecting my dad to be going at any time for years and years. The doctors had predicted that my father could not possibly live past 50, and here he was, 74. Countless Christmases, all of us kids would huddle together and get teary-eyed because we just knew this was the last Christmas with Dad, only to find ourselves crying again the next year because surely this would be the last Christmas with Dad, and we adored him. Finally, a couple of weeks after one visit, my mother called to say that my father was unconscious. When I got back to Spokane, my mother and the hospice nurses were caring for my father in this hospital bed in the middle of the living room. It was basically a death watch. Family was starting to arrive. My sister Meg was flying in from Japan with her husband Tsuyoshi, my brothers, my aunts, my uncles. The hospice nurses were wonderful. One of them was particularly religious, and she kept saying, "I think your father is seeing the others who've passed over before him." My mother told me that a couple of days before my dad lost consciousness, the same hospice nurse had said to my dad, "Who are you going to miss most in this life, Bob?" Which really irked me. Just the automatic assumption that someone is capable of missing someone after they're dead and then being asked to rank them in order. But for my mother and the hospice nurse and my father, that's actually a reasonable question. And my father gestured to his right side where no one was standing and said, "Janice, we don't know any Janices." My mom's pretty sure that my dad didn't know any Janices either. Janice. Well, there's two things I remember about my dad dying, and one thing I remember not being able to remember. I remember how quickly his body got cold after he died. I was so shocked at what heat we all must generate. Everyone else I've been around at or near death, my brother Mike, my dear friend Judy, their bodies were whisked away right after they died. But my dad's body just stayed in the living room for about 6 hours after he died, and we all just got to be with him, pet his head and kiss his cheeks and laugh and cry and reminisce. And then I remember later that night suddenly being aware that I couldn't remember the last time my dad and I had hugged. What was the last time? My last trip, I suppose. Where were we? At the coat closet? What did I say? "See you later. Take care." I can't remember. But I do remember a couple of days before he died, when my dad was unconscious and I was alone with him on the night watch, and he suddenly opened his eyes and focused his gaze right at me. I asked him to squeeze my hand. He didn't. His eyes were bright and blue, and it looked like the universe in there. We held each other's gaze, and it still seems to me like time just stopped right then. And then his eyes unfocused and his lids closed. Well, my mother wanted to set the date of the funeral right away, which we could not delay because so many people were in town already from such faraway places. So my mother gathered me and my sister and my brothers, and we all headed down to Lourdes for Saturday's 5:30 p.m. Mass. About 30 people were waiting in the pews for Mass to begin. We were standing on the side of the altar looking into the sacristy where we could see Monsignor Ribble putting on his vestments. To me, it was too late to interrupt him before the Mass, but my mother said, "Follow me," and she started to walk right across the altar, right across where you're not supposed to go, towards the sacristy with her head held high. I followed her, and so did our whole family, heads bowed, shoulders hunched, coats dangling. Walking across that altar, I never felt so shanty Irish. My mother never looked so determined, and I never loved our family more. Monsignor Ribble was very sad about the news of my father's death and did not in any way seem to be upset that we'd all just descended on him right before Mass. Not only was my father in his 6:30 a.m. Mass every single morning, the two of them had actually taken an exercise class together for survivors of heart attacks that Sacred Heart Hospital put on. I remember picking up my dad one time and being so surprised to see Monsignor Ribble without his collar and in these gray sweats doing step-ups and step-together steps. Monsignor asked me if I was going to be speaking at the funeral, and I said, "I suppose so." And he took me aside and he said, "I will ask you to refrain from speaking about your knowledge pilgrimage." It was like he said, "Your sexual orgy drug-induced pilgrimage." I said, "Oh, I wouldn't. We went right into the Mass, and Monsignor's homily was all about the need for priests in the Catholic Church. He described the situation as desperate. I looked down the pew at my brothers and sister. None of us are Catholic, except my sister Meg, who is so far at least choosing not to have children. Are we typical? Monsignor went on to talk about the mystery of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit being one, and the mystery of how God loves us in spite of our faults. And before I knew it, I was sitting in my father's funeral in the exact same pew. I looked around the church at all my friends, and my father's friends, and our family's friends, and my family, and I got caught up. I looked at the altar through my father's eyes, and it was rich and beautiful. I was baptized in this very church when I was 1 week old. In so many real ways, I'll never stop being Catholic. Christianity helped shape my brain. It suddenly seemed inevitable to me that after all this searching, I would now return to the Catholic Church. I unexpectedly felt right back where I started, surprised, like Dorothy back from Oz. After all, when I left the Catholic Church, I didn't realize I was going to be giving up on God altogether. I just thought I would find some other church that made more sense to me. Maybe this time it would be more meaningful somehow because I wouldn't be debating all the time over what I believed and what I didn't believe. I would know that I just didn't believe in any of it. After all, maybe objective reality isn't the most pleasant prism through which we can view this world. And maybe by using fantasy, we can allow ourselves to glimpse at something even greater than we otherwise would be able to. Let's face it, truth is such a poor competitor in the marketplace of ideas, and the love and the community in this church are real and potent, even if God isn't. Well, we had the wake across the street from the cathedral at the Spokane Club. I got up and said, "I wish my dad could be here tonight to see his family and friends. He would have loved this party so very much." I had no idea that I had just said something quasi-controversial, and over the evening, several people came up to me and said, "I think your father is here." right now, right in this very room. One person came up to me and said, "You know you're Jewish, right?" And I said, "What? Do you know something about me that I don't know about me?" And he said, "No, it's just that Jews are sort of expected to wrestle with the idea of God. Even if you don't want to, it's almost like an obligation. You would fit in perfect." Well, I went outside and I looked at Lourdes Cathedral in the moonlight, and I thought, I can't rejoin this church. I would start listening to the words again, and it would just drive me nuts. But I do wish there were a beautiful building where I could ritualize the transitions in my life and in my daughter's life with great music and great art, but where what we know about the world just isn't blatantly ignored. You know, a few months ago, Stephen Hawking came out and said that his theory that black holes obliterate anything that falls into them, probably his greatest contribution to science, the theory that much of his particular fame and reputation is based on, probably isn't right. Wouldn't it be great if the Pope could just do the same thing? If he could just come out and say, "Oh my, I've been reading what science shows us about our spectacular but very humble place in this universe, and it is thrilling and mind-boggling beyond all imaginings. It makes the Bible so puny and uninspired and even less poetic by comparison. I am terribly sorry. I sincerely misunderstood so much. I almost wish there were a God so that I could be punished for all of the suffering that I have caused human beings. But since there will be no cosmic punishment for me, I think I'll spend the rest of my life working in a family planning clinic in Latin America." Good day. Well, Mulan and I came back to Los Angeles after my father's funeral, and 2 days later, our cat Rita died. Mulan understood death at this time like a 4-year-old understands death, which means not really getting it. It's like people and animals are suddenly gone, but, you know, they got to be somewhere. Sometimes she'd say to me, "Why didn't Grandpa come to his big party?" And I resisted the urge to say, "Some of the people thought he was." Well, a couple of weeks later, there was a knock at my front door, and who was there but 2 Mormon missionary boys, and they said they had a message for me from God. I said, I actually already got my message from God. About 3 years ago or so, a couple of Mormon missionaries stopped by here, and you know, they basically changed my entire life. And they said, "They did?" And I said, "Yeah, because of them, I don't believe in God at all anymore." I mean, they probably didn't affect me in exactly the way they might have hoped, but for me, it has been a very exciting journey. They didn't seem nearly as excited as I was. Well, on Father's Day that year, Mulan and I and our new dog, Arden, went hiking in Runyon Canyon, which for us means walking very slowly uphill with a lot of rests. And we got to this one place called Inspiration Point that looks out over the city. And Mulan ran up and said, "Mom, look, it's the whole world. Where's China?" And I said, "Oh, honey, you can't see China from here, but if you look way out there, you can see Santa Monica." We started up the hill again, this much steeper part. Mulan was just ahead of me. And she said, "Who's Santa again?" And I said, "Oh, you remember, honey. He's that guy at Christmas time, that made-up, pretend, mythological guy." She whipped around on the hill, so she was at eye level with me. She said, "Mom, Santa lives at the North Pole and brings you presents on Christmas if you're good?" And I said, yes, that's exactly right. My mother says Mulan is going to grow up to be a nun, and that's how God is going to get his revenge on me. Who knows, maybe Mulan will be a nun, but I hope that I can teach her that true mystery is really all around her. Because, you know, the church really has it all backwards when it comes to mystery. In fact, it trivializes the very thing it claims to represent, the awe-inspiring grandeur of true deep mystery. We live on a planet, spinning about in a wondrous universe without any apparent purpose, and the mystery of why there is something rather than nothing is a question we'll probably never know the answer to. Well, I looked down at Mulan, who was brushing the bangs out of her eyes, and I thought, wow, if even our memories are so transient, All any one of us truly has is this very moment. And Mulan looked up at me and said, "Are Grandpa and Rita together?" And I said, "No, they died. But it's nice to think about them together, isn't it?" And she said, "Well, I think they are together." And I said, "Well, what do you imagine they're doing?" And she said, "Rita's sitting on Grandpa's lap and she's purring." And I said, "Isn't that nice to think that? You see, people do live on after they die, inside of us, just thinking about them." And she said, "What I think about is in my head?" And I said, "Yes, that's your brain. Anytime you want, you just think and think and think about whatever you want." And she said, "Well, I'm thinking about Legoland." And I said, "Legoland?" And she said, "Legoland." And I said, "All right, sounds like a plan."
First I was a Catholic girl, loved the Mass, I watched the swirl of smoke from candles burning, while Mary looked up yearning. I got confirmed and I confessed, I really felt that I was blessed. Plus I love my uniform, so did the boy who lived next door. But something changed when I became of age.